Sarah Chan's eyes snapped open as a scream tore from her throat, her body drenched in cold sweat. The familiar sensation of silk sheets against her skin made her freeze. These weren't the cheap cotton ones from her current studio apartment. These were her old Ralph Lauren sheets, the ones she'd been forced to sell 2 years ago. Her heart pounding, Sarah bolted upright. The morning sun filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a spacious bedroom she hadn't seen in years. Her designer handbags still hung on their dedicated hooks. Her collection of architectural awards still lined the shelves, and her prized Kandinsky prints still graced the wall opposite her bed. Everything she'd lost was here, exactly as it had been before James Walker destroyed her life. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone on the nightstand. The device? Her old iPhone 11, not the second-hand Android she'd been using, displayed a date that made her blood run cold. March 15, 2020. 5 years in the past. 1 week before she would meet James at the Metropolitan Museum's annual charity gala. "This isn't possible," Sarah whispered, her fingers gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She navigated to her banking app, and tears sprang to her eyes at the sight of her healthy savings account. The money she'd invested in James's fraudulent tech startup, her entire life savings, plus a second mortgage, was still there. A notification popped up on her screen. Breaking news. Tech innovator found dead in apparent suicide. Sarah's stomach lurched as she clicked the link. Elena Rodriguez, 34, brilliant software engineer and founder of a promising AI startup, had been found dead in her Manhattan apartment. The article mentioned she'd recently lost significant investments in a fraudulent scheme. Sarah's hands began to shake. In her timeline, Elena's death wouldn't happen for another 8 months, after James had systematically stripped her of her company, her patents, and her dignity. She'd been the first of his victims to take her own life, but not the last. Stumbling out of bed, Sarah rushed to her walk-in closet. In the back, behind her winter coats, she found what she was looking for, her old leather-bound diary. She'd burned it after James's disappearance, unable to bear reeling her own naive observations of their relationship. But now, as she flipped through the blank pages, she realized what a powerful tool it could become. Sarah grabbed a pen and began writing frantically, documenting everything she could remember: dates, names, bank account numbers, shell companies, and most importantly, his pattern. James targeted successful women in tech and architecture, using their own expertise to make his fake startup seem legitimate. He studied them for months before accidentally meeting them, knowing exactly which emotional buttons to push. A text message chimed on her phone. "Don't forget, Charity Gala Committee meeting at 2 p.m. We need your final RSVP for next week's event. Rachel." Rachel, her best friend who defended Sarah when others called her foolish for trusting James, only to have her own design firm bankrupted when she invested in his second scheme. In Sarah's timeline, Rachel had never fully recovered from the betrayal, her once vibrant spirit permanently dimmed. Standing at her window overlooking the Manhattan skyline, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't just avoid James's trap this time. She would stop him before he could destroy any more lives. Elena Rodriguez might be beyond her help now, but there were 11 other women she could save, including Rachel. Sarah opened her laptop and began researching financial fraud investigators. This time, she had something no other victim had ever had: detailed knowledge of crimes that hadn't happened yet. As she typed, her screensaver flickered to life. A photo from her original timeline, taken just days before James disappeared. His arm was around her shoulders, his charismatic smile concealing the predator beneath. "Game on, James," Sarah whispered, closing the laptop with determination. "This time, I know exactly who you are." The coffee shop buzzed with morning energy as Sarah watched Diane Foster through the window, her heart racing. In her previous life, she'd only known Diane from newspaper headlines, another brilliant woman destroyed by James Walker. Now, watching her confidently order her morning latte, Sarah could hardly reconcile this vibrant person with the broken woman she'd read about. "Ms. Foster," Sarah called out as Diane exited the cafe. She'd rehearsed this moment countless times, but her voice still trembled. "I'm Sarah Chen from Morton Architecture. I couldn't help but notice your TED talk on sustainable urban development." Diane's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "You've seen that. Most people in architecture still think green design is a passing trend." She shifted her coffee to her left hand, extending her right for a handshake. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. This was exactly how James had approached his victims, doing detailed research and appealing to their professional passions. But where his research had been meant to destroy, hers was meant to save. "Actually, I'd love to discuss your ideas about integrating vertical gardens into office spaces," Sarah continued, falling into step beside Diane. "I'm working on a proposal that—" Her phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. "Where are you?" "Emergency meeting with Rodriguez Tech. Their CEO is here, and he's gorgeous. Get your ass to the office now." Sarah's stomach dropped. Marcus Rodriguez wasn't supposed to enter her life for another 3 weeks, and not like this. She'd planned to meet him at the Sustainable Architecture Conference in Boston, where their first conversation had lasted 6 hours. Now, by avoiding the charity gala where she'd originally met James, she'd accidentally accelerated her timeline with Marcus. "I'm so sorry." Sarah apologized to Diane, genuine regret in her voice. "Work emergency. But please take my card. I'd love to continue this conversation." Diane's smile faltered slightly. "Of course, although I'm actually considering an exciting investment opportunity in the tech sector. Perhaps we could discuss both projects over dinner?" Ice shot through Sarah's veins. James had already made contact with Diane. She was too late. 20 minutes later, Sarah burst into Morton Architecture's main conference room, freezing at the sight before her. Marcus Rodriguez stood at the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the Manhattan skyline. But it was the woman beside him that made Sarah's blood run cold. Rachel, gazing up at him with the same mesmerized expression she'd worn when James first charmed her. "Sarah." Rachel waved her over enthusiastically. "Mr. Rodriguez was just explaining his vision for a completely sustainable corporate headquarters. It's revolutionary." Marcus turned, and Sarah felt the same magnetic pull she'd experienced in her past life. His dark eyes held that familiar intensity, but now she noticed something she'd missed before in her James-induced haze, a gentleness behind the ambition. "Ms. Chen," he extended his hand. "Your reputation precedes you. I studied your work on the Shanghai Cultural Center. The way you integrated traditional elements with modern sustainable technology was inspired." Sarah shook his hand, fighting the urge to recoil from the memories it triggered. "Mr. Rodriguez." "Marcus, please." "Marcus," she corrected, pulling out her portfolio. "I actually have some initial concepts that might interest you." Her phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "Missed you at the committee meeting. The gala won't be the same without you. James Walker." Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for her designs. James had noticed her absence. He was adapting his strategy, and now he knew exactly where to find her. Sarah's world tilted on its axis as she watched Rachel laugh at something James had said across the crowded restaurant. 3 weeks of careful planning, of strategic, accidental meetings with his potential victims, and somehow James had still managed to infiltrate her inner circle. Even worse, he'd done it through the one person she couldn't bear to lose again. "Your design for the living wall system is brilliant," Marcus said beside her, his voice pulling her attention back to their business dinner. "The way you've integrated the water recycling with the building's main systems, I've never seen anything like it." Sarah forced herself to focus on Marcus, trying to ignore the sound of Rachel's laughter. "The real innovation is in the soil composition. I've been working with environmental scientists, too." "Sarah." Rachel's voice cut through the restaurant's ambient noise. "Come meet James. He's working on something amazing with AI and sustainable energy. You two have to talk." Marcus's expression shifted subtly. "James Walker. I've heard that name recently." Sarah's heart stuttered. "You know him?" "Not directly, but my mother." Marcus paused, his fingers tightening around his water glass. "She was an environmental engineer. Brilliant woman. She fell for a similar pitch about revolutionary green technology. Lost everything. The shame. He shook his head. She couldn't live with it. The story hit Sarah like a physical blow. In her past life, James had used this exact narrative to manipulate her, claiming his passion for sustainable technology came from watching a friend's mother fall victim to investment fraud. He'd stolen Marcus's tragedy, twisted it into a tool for his cons. Marcus, Sarah started, but Rachel was already dragging James toward their table. Sarah Chen, James extended his hand, his smile exactly as she remembered it. Rachel tells me you're revolutionizing sustainable architecture. We should talk about potential synergies. Sarah felt Marcus stiffen beside her. Taking James's hand was like touching a live wire, memories of their past future flooding her mind. Mr. Walker, your reputation precedes you. All good things, I hope? James's eyes glittered with challenge. That depends. Sarah met his gaze steadily. On who you ask. Rachel shot her a warning look. Sarah's just protective of her work, but James's AI system for optimizing energy consumption is incredible. He showed me the preliminary data. Sarah's stomach churned. The data. She remembered those perfectly crafted spreadsheets, the convincing projections. She'd spent months after James's disappearance trying to understand how she'd missed the obvious mathematical impossibilities. Actually, Marcus interjected, I'd love to hear more about this AI system. My company has been working on similar technology. The flash of calculation in James's eyes was nearly imperceptible. We should set up a proper meeting. Compare notes. No. Sarah's response came too quickly. 3 heads turned to her in surprise. Marcus, we should focus on the headquarters project first. Scope creep kills innovative designs. Sarah's right. Marcus nodded, but his expression was puzzled. Another time perhaps, Mr. Walker. Later, as Sarah watched Marcus's car pull away from the restaurant, her phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. What was that about? James is perfect. Smart. Successful. Caring. Don't ruin this for me with your trust issues. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering how Rachel had sobbed in her arms after losing her company to James's scheme. Opening them again, she typed out a response to another message. This one from Marcus. About dinner. There's something you should know about James Walker. Can we meet? Alone. The reply came instantly. My office. 1 hour. Bring everything you have. The USB drive sat innocently on Sarah's desk, unmarked except for a small infinity symbol etched into its surface. Her morning coffee grew cold beside her keyboard as she stared at it, remembering the company-wide email about heightened security protocols. No unauthorized devices, no unknown files. But the contents of the drive haunted her. She'd already checked it on an isolated laptop. Spreadsheets detailing James's victims, past and future, with dates that shouldn't exist yet. Bank transfers, shell companies, and most disturbing of all, surveillance photos of her meetings with Marcus over the past 2 weeks. Someone's been watching, she murmured, running her finger over the infinity symbol. The question was, friend or foe? Her office door opened, and Sarah quickly slipped the drive into her desk drawer. Marcus stood in the doorway, his usual confidence tempered by something darker. Sarah, do you have a minute? She nodded, trying to ignore how her heart raced whenever he was near. In the 2 weeks since their dinner with James, they'd spent countless hours working on the headquarters project. Each meeting made it harder to remember this was supposed to be strategic, a way to protect Rachel and expose James. The tech conference called, Marcus said, settling into the chair across from her. They want you to be the keynote speaker. Your ideas about integrating AI with sustainable architecture, they're revolutionary. Sarah's breath caught. The conference, where James had originally pitched his fake startup to a room full of potential victims. Marcus, Before you answer, he leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. There's something else. The conference has a new primary sponsor. He slid a document across her desk. Walker Innovation Labs. James pulled some strings, Marcus continued. Said he was impressed by your work. But Sarah, he hesitated. The way you reacted to him at dinner, The questions you've been asking about his company. What aren't you telling me? Sarah's fingers trembled as she touched the conference document. This was her chance to tell Marcus everything about his mother's story being stolen, about James's true nature. But the surveillance photos flashed in her mind. Someone was watching, documenting her every move. I need to show you something, she said finally, reaching for her desk drawer. But as she pulled it open, her blood ran cold. The USB drive was gone. A knock at her door made them both jump. Rachel bounded in, her face glowing. Sarah, you'll never believe. She stopped short, noting the tension in the room. Am I interrupting something? No, Sarah stood quickly. What's up? Rachel's smile returned full force as she held up her left hand. A massive diamond caught the morning light. James proposed. Last night at the rooftop garden of his new building. It was perfect. You have to be my maid of honor. The room spun slightly. In Sarah's original timeline, she'd been the one wearing James's ring, while Rachel had been her maid of honor. The reversal felt like a cruel joke. Congratulations, Marcus said smoothly, rising to give Rachel a hug. We should celebrate. Dinner tonight? My treat. Actually, Rachel's eyes sparkled. James is hosting an engagement party tonight at the Edison. His whole tech team will be there. You'll both come, right? Sarah, I need my best friend there. Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. Interesting files you had this morning. Better be careful who you trust. Some secrets are deadly. Ask Marcus about David. Sarah looked up at Marcus, who was studying a design schematic on her wall, then at Rachel, radiant with joy that would soon turn to ashes. The web of lies was tightening, and she was no longer sure who was spinning it. The tech conference hummed with energy as Sarah stood backstage, adjusting her presentation materials. Through the curtain, she could see James working the crowd, his charm turned up to full wattage. Every so often, his gaze would drift to where she stood, a predatory gleam in his eyes that only she seemed to notice. 10 minutes until your keynote, the stage manager announced. Sarah nodded, her fingers brushing against her phone. Where the latest anonymous message still glowed, David knew about James. That's why he disappeared 6 years ago. Ask Marcus what really happened to his best friend. Nervous? James's voice made her jump. He'd materialized beside her, looking impeccable in his tailored suit. You shouldn't be. Your work is fascinating. Especially that vertical garden system you designed for Marcus. Reminds me of a project I saw in Singapore last year. Sarah's heart stopped. The exact words he'd used in her previous life, when he'd first started working his way into her confidence. Singapore. I wasn't aware you'd been there. Oh yes. James moved closer, his cologne triggering unwanted memories. I remember every detail. The way the sunlight hit the glass at dawn. The specific angle of the hydroponic tubes. He paused meaningfully. Almost like I'm seeing it twice. Before Sarah could process the implication, Marcus appeared, his face tense. Sarah, can we talk? Now. She followed him to a quiet corner, away from the crowd. What's wrong? I found something in the old company files. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd learned meant he was deeply troubled. About David, he didn't just disappear. The night before, he sent me an email about a massive fraud scheme he'd uncovered, something about time patterns repeating. Sarah's mouth went dry. Marcus. 5 minutes. The stage manager called out. Tell me after your speech. Marcus squeezed her hand. Break a leg. The lights felt too bright as Sarah took the stage. Her presentation on sustainable AI architecture flowed smoothly, but her mind raced. James's words about Singapore, David's email about time patterns, the infinity symbol on the USB drive. Could she not be the only one who'd lived this timeline before? And now, she concluded, I'd like to introduce our conference sponsor, James Walker, to share his vision for the future of sustainable technology. James took the stage, that familiar charismatic smile in place. But as he passed her, he whispered, Interesting how history repeats itself, isn't it, Sarah? The room spun slightly. She made her way to her seat, where she found an envelope waiting. Inside was a photograph, dated 6 years ago, showing David meeting with a woman who looked exactly like her. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. But this time with a video attachment. Sarah's hands shook as she pressed play. It showed a hotel corridor where James and David stood in heated discussion. "You can't stop what's coming." James's voice was clear in the footage. "Some cycles are meant to repeat." "Not if I warn them," David replied. "Not if I tell Marcus about." The video cut off abruptly. Another message followed. "Meeting room 3B. Now. Time we talked about what really happened 6 years ago." Sarah looked up to find Marcus watching her intently from across the room. James was still on stage, discussing his fraudulent AI system with practiced sincerity. And through the conference room window, she could see Rachel arriving, engagement ring glittering under the lights. The weight of all three timelines, her past, her present, and whatever future was now unfolding, pressed down on her as she stood. Meeting room 3B awaited, and with it, answers she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Meeting room 3B was dark when Sarah entered, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. The wall of windows overlooked the city skyline, now dotted with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. A laptop sat open on the conference table, its screen casting a blue glow across the empty chairs. "Hello, Sarah." The voice came from the shadows. Or should I say, Sarah version 2.0. David stepped into the dim light. Not the David from 6 years ago in the video, but older, his face lined with the weight of too many secrets. He looked exactly like the photo in Marcus's office, the one labeled "in memory of." "You're supposed to be dead," Sarah whispered. "So are you, in the original timeline." David moved to the laptop, typing quickly. James made sure of that, just like he did with Marcus's mother and Elena, and all the others who got too close to the truth. Thunder rumbled outside as Sarah sank into a chair. "How many times has this happened?" "This is the 4th iteration I've tracked." David turned the laptop toward her. The screen showed a complex diagram of timeline branches, each marked with dates and critical events. "James isn't just a con man, Sarah. He's something else. Something that shouldn't be possible. He remembers." Sarah's voice shook. "He knew about Singapore, about conversations that haven't happened yet. Because they already have, for him." David leaned forward. "Every time someone gets close to exposing him, every time his scheme falls apart, he finds a way to reset. But this time is different. This time you remembered too." Sarah's phone buzzed. Rachel sending wedding venue photos. The sight of her best friend's joy felt like a knife to the heart. 3 days, she murmured. "Rachel's wedding is in 3 days. It won't happen." David's voice was grim. "I've gathered enough evidence to." The door burst open. Marcus stood there, his face a mask of shock. "David?" "Marcus, wait." But David never finished. A screech of tires came from the street below, followed by the devastating sound of impact. They rushed to the windows just in time to see a black SUV speed away from the crumpled form of a car wrapped around a lamppost. Marcus was already running for the elevators. Sarah moved to follow, but David grabbed her arm. "The documents." He pressed a key into her hand. "Safety deposit box at First National. Everything you need to stop him is there, including what really happened to Marcus's mother." "David, please. Find Diane Foster. She's not just another victim. She's the key to understanding how he does it, how he moves through time." David's eyes were desperate. "Promise me you'll finish this, Sarah. Promise me." The elevator dinged down the hall. David disappeared through a service door just as Marcus returned, his face ashen. "He's dead. The driver, my best friend, he's gone." Sarah held Marcus as he broke down, the key burning in her palm like a brand. Through the window, she could see James watching from the conference room across the street, his phone to his ear. Even from this distance, she could read his lips. "It's done." Her own phone chimed with a message from Rachel. "Dress fitting tomorrow. Can't wait to see you there, maid of honor. James says he has a surprise for all of us." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of David's key, of Marcus's grief, of Rachel's impending heartbreak. The storm outside had reached them, rain lashing against the windows like tears. 3 days until the wedding. 3 days to decode David's evidence. 3 days to stop a man who could bend time itself. Thunder cracked again, and in its flash, Sarah could have sworn she saw David's reflection in the window, multiplied across infinite versions of this moment, each one ending in tragedy. Unless she found a way to break the cycle once and for all. Lightning split the sky as Sarah stood before her mirror, adjusting the emerald green bridesmaid dress that Rachel had chosen. The safety deposit box key lay heavy in her clutch, along with a small recording device, her insurance policy for what was about to unfold. Her phone buzzed with a message from Diane Foster. Found the original blueprints you asked for. The quantum computing lab beneath Walker Innovation Labs. It's not just theoretical physics. He's building something impossible. Another message followed. Sarah, if you're right about the time displacement, be careful. The energy readings from that lab suggest he's preparing for another reset. Today, the church bells began to toll as Sarah's car pulled up to St. Patrick's Cathedral. Rain pounded against the Gothic architecture, giving the wedding an ominous atmosphere that only she seemed to notice. Rachel waited in the bride's room, radiant in white, blissfully unaware that her wedding day would become a battlefield. You look stunning, Sarah managed, hugging her best friend. I can't believe it's finally happening. Rachel beamed. And James has been so mysterious about his surprise announcement. He says it will change everything. It certainly will, Sarah murmured, touching the recording device through her dress. The evidence from David's safety deposit box had confirmed her worst fears. James wasn't just resetting time. He was stealing energy from each timeline, using the accumulated power to extend his control, to reach further back with each loop. A knock at the door revealed Marcus, his face still haunted from David's death. They're ready for us. The ceremony began like a scene from a fairy tale, with sunshine briefly breaking through the storms. Sarah took her place beside Rachel, watching James stand at the altar with his practiced smile. In her purse, the recording device captured every word, every sacred vow that would soon be revealed as lies. Then came the moment she'd been waiting for, James's surprise announcement. Before we exchange rings, he turned to address the gathered crowd. I want to share something extraordinary, a breakthrough that will revolutionize not just technology, but time itself. Sarah's hand tightened around her clutch as James continued, his words growing more grandiose. He was revealing too much, drunk on his apparent victory. And then, the quantum manipulation of temporal energy, he declared proudly, allowing us to reshape reality itself. And I have all of you to thank, especially my investors. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Rachel's face showed the first flicker of doubt. In fact, James's eyes locked onto Sarah's. Some of you might even remember different versions of this day. Different timelines. Isn't that right, Sarah? The church fell silent. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. Different timelines. Different victims. Same predator. She pulled out her phone, playing David's final video confession. James's face twisted as his own voice filled the cathedral, detailing murders across multiple timelines. You think this changes anything? James laughed, but there was fear in his eyes. I'll just reset again. Start over. I always do. Not this time. Sarah nodded to the back of the church, where Diane Foster stepped forward with a team of federal agents. Your lab is already being seized. The quantum core is shut down. Impossible. James reached into his pocket, lucky for whatever device triggered his resets. But Marcus was faster. In one fluid motion, he tackled James to the ground. That's for David, Marcus growled, as agents swarmed forward. Rachel stood frozen at the altar, her perfect day shattered. Sarah, what's happening? Thunder cracked overhead as Sarah moved to comfort her friend. But before she could reach Rachel, a blinding light filled the cathedral. James had managed to trigger something. One last desperate attempt to reset the timeline. Sarah grabbed Rachel's hand, holding tight as reality began to blur. This time, she wouldn't let go. This time, she would save everyone. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the rooftop garden of Rodriguez Tech's new headquarters, her fingers tracing the infinity symbol etched into the marble memorial. In memory of David Chen, the plaque read, who changed time to save lives. Below it, a smaller inscription, "And for all those who fought to make the future right." The garden was her finest work, a living testament to survival and renewal. Vertical farms stretched toward the sky, their innovative design already being replicated in cities worldwide. The quantum energy that James had once used for destruction now powered the building's revolutionary sustainability systems. Thanks to Diane Foster's brilliant reconceptualization of the technology. "I thought I'd find you here." Marcus's voice came from behind her, still checking on the plants personally. Sarah turned, smiling at the sight of him. The past year had softened the grief in his eyes, replaced it with something warmer. Old habits. Besides, the view at sunset is unbeatable. "That's actually why I asked you to meet me here." Marcus joined her at the railing, looking out over the city. "Do you remember what you told me that night after James's arrest? About living through it all twice?" Sarah's heart skipped. That conversation had been the hardest part of the aftermath. Explaining to Marcus how she'd known everything, how she'd lived a future that no longer existed. To her surprise, he hadn't called her crazy. Instead, he'd shown her an old letter from his mother, found in David's safety deposit box. "Your mother knew," Sarah said softly. "She discovered James's first attempts at temporal manipulation. That's why he targeted her." "She knew more than that." Marcus reached into his jacket, pulling out a worn envelope. "David kept this letter in the box, separate from the evidence files. I've read it 100 times, but this part..." He unfolded the paper, his mother's elegant handwriting still clear. "When you find her, Marcus, the woman who fights through time to make things right, give her my ring. Some loves are strong enough to echo across all possible futures." Sarah's breath caught as Marcus dropped to one knee, holding out a vintage emerald ring she'd never seen before. "My mother wore this for 30 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She wrote that letter 6 years before you and I ever met, in any timeline. Somehow, she knew you were coming." Tears blurred Sarah's vision as Marcus continued. "I'm not asking because of some predetermined fate. I'm asking because watching you this past year, seeing your strength, your dedication to helping others, the brilliant way your mind works, I fall more in love with you every day. Sarah Chen, will you marry me?" Before she could answer, the rooftop door opened. Rachel stepped out, followed by Diane Foster. Both women had healed in their own ways over the past year. Rachel throwing herself into rebuilding her design firm. Diane leading the scientific team that ensured no one could ever abuse temporal energy again. "Did she say yes yet?" Rachel called out, grinning. "The champagne's getting warm." Sarah laughed through her tears, turning back to Marcus. "Yes," she whispered, "in this timeline and every other." As their friends rushed forward with congratulations, Sarah's phone lit up with one final message from an unknown number. "The cycle is broken. The future is yours now." "D?" Sarah looked at the infinity symbol on David's memorial, then at the ring on her finger, a perfect circle, representing not endless repetition, but endless possibility. The sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky in colors she'd never seen in her previous life, promising a future that was finally truly new. Marcus squeezed her hand, and Sarah squeezed back, knowing that some loves really were strong enough to transcend time itself. Not because they were destined, but because they were chosen, fought for, and won, one precious moment at a time.